I hope I keep getting weird connection messages. One moment. The little wheel is just spinning in circles, so I'm not sure recording yet. So give me a second. This is crazy, 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 crazy.
Hi, Randy, this is George. On mine, it says we are recording.
Okay, we are recording. All right, thank you so much for your patience. George, I'm going to go off screen and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the governor's office.
You might want to speak up. We can't hear you very well. Maybe get a little closer to your microphone.
Is this any better?
That is better. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, thank you for having me here. The governor's office and everyone else that's coordinating for this webinar. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title I, and the workplace and substance abuse. Next slide, please. So, again, I'm George Powers. I work at the Southwest ADA Center, which is one of 10 regional centers that is federally funded to provide technical assistance, trainings, and recreate materials, and just all kinds of stuff like that. A bit about me. I'm an attorney. I'm a licensed attorney in Texas. I've been at the ADA Center for about 6 years. I went to law school at U of H, and then I studied speech and communications before that at Trinity University in San Antonio. My involvement in the disability community has been pretty extensive as well. I was a member of the Houston Commission on People with Disabilities. I've served on a few task forces for the mayor's office here in Houston, one on accessible transportation. I've also been involved in the Real Abilities Film Festival, and so on. So that's enough about me. The reason I have this slide in here is twofold. One is I just want you to know that even though I'm an attorney, I'm not your attorney. That what I say here is not meant to be construed as legal advice. And the reason I do that is because, one, I don't want to get in trouble. But two, the reason I do it is because the law is very gray in this area. Most ADA issues are very murky. It's not black and white. And so if I tell you something, it could be right under a certain circumstance, in a certain state, in a certain city, if you're in front of a certain judge. But again, it could also be wrong in front of a different judge. So whenever you're making decisions that affect your legal risk, you always want to consult with your own attorney and not base those decisions entirely on what I say. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off by first talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, just a brief overview. And then we're going to move into like substance abuse and reasonable accommodations for employees with that disability. So why should a person care about the Americans with Disabilities Act? Well, for one, because it's federal law. You know, if you violate a federal law, you can get into trouble, usually a lawsuit. Next slide. The second thing is it's not really too difficult to comply with Title I of the ADA and provide reasonable accommodations. And most people, will eventually have a disability. And I think maybe the reality we find ourselves in today, it's kind of understandable that a person can get sick just randomly, be perfectly healthy, but the next day they can have a disability and not do the daily tasks that they were able to, before they got hit with the condition. Next slide. Excuse me. And like I said, accommodations are usually not very costly, especially for employers. The average cost is about $500, and that's a lot cheaper than firing an employee, rehiring, and training a new employee. Next slide. So obviously there's a number of types of disabilities, but today we're going to be talking about non-obvious or hidden disabilities. Next slide, substance abuse. And so the overarching purpose of the ADA is to ensure equal access to society for people with disabilities, is to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities. So there's 5 titles. Really the first 3 are the ones we talk about the most, but today we're just going to focus on Title I, which is employment. Next slide. And so just the basics of Title I are that, it's enforced by the EEOC. People always think that the ADA Center is the ADA police, but we're not. All we do is really explain what the law states. That's our role, but there's different agencies that enforce the law. Like Title III and Title II can be enforced by the DOJ, Department of Justice. Next slide, please. So Title I applies to most employers, and it definitely applies to employees who have 15 or more employees. And it just doesn't end, Title I's coverage just doesn't end in the office. It's anything that the employer and the employee do. It's anything to do with that relationship. So when you go off-site for a training, or if you have even like an office party off-site, or if you use a third party to train your employees, you still have a responsibility to make sure that that third party provides accessible training. So it's not just at the office, it's the whole relationship. Next slide. And these are some reasonable accommodations that employers usually provide to employees. And I think this is a good step, or a good place to stop and see if people have any questions about the ADA. Next slide.
No questions yet, George. I will say it's interesting that you said a lot of people think that this center, the Southwest ADA Center, has this legal authority to go after people. I often have received calls that I'm going to call the ADA, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And people think there's this. A lot of people do anyway, seem to think that there's this place, this ADA place, and it's, like you said, it can be very gray in areas, and who's can investigate which parts of it. But anyway, so no questions on general information about the ADA, so we'll just go forward.
Randy, is my audio okay now?
It is. I believe it's okay. Would someone like to tell me in the chat box? Oh, no, it does. Somebody said having a hard time hearing George. It sounds on my end like he's underwater.
Okay. Can I call in? and try it that way?
Sure, you sure can. Go right ahead.
Okay, let me just call it in.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, you can stay connected this way as well.
Mm-hmm.
You will probably have to turn your microphone off or down. You could get feedback. And let me know when you're connected, George. We do have a question. I see Marissa's on, so I'm going to go ahead and ask. Oh, there you are, George. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think I joined by phone, but what was the question?
The question is, how can the person with ADA utilize their right when they incur an issue with employers?
Okay.
Take advantage of your rights, I guess.
So, like I said, the best thing is just to talk with the employer. There's this obligation that employers have under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's called the interactive process. So anytime you feel like, as a person with a disability, you feel like things are not right at work, the best thing is just to talk to the appropriate person, the appropriate manager, or the appropriate person at Human Resources, whoever you feel more comfortable with disclosing that information to. And then, so like I said, they have this obligation, it's called the interactive process, to talk back to you and see, whether or not your issues or your concerns can be addressed. And that's usually through reasonable accommodations. And we'll talk about that a bit later in this context. But if that doesn't work, which happens sometimes, then the only option really you have is to file a complaint with the EEOC. And then I'm going to talk about just some enforcement options at the end. But just remember that the EEOC is responsible for enforcing Title I of the ADA. Okay, let's move on to the next section. And then we can see about other alternatives for communicating or for me connecting. But let's see. The reason that this issue came up or might come up now is because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. There's a coronavirus and a lot of people are scared. There's a lot of uncertainties, and that can make people's depression and anxiety and other psychiatric issues worse. And there's actually studies that show this. Next slide.
Oops.
And like I said, just one of these studies was done in Canada, and it found that like alcohol consumption since the start of the crisis has gone up. And just anecdotally, you can kind of see some stories in the news where things like this have happened, where alcohol or liquor stores have, are short on supplies and so on. Next slide. And the EEOC even acknowledges this, and in their guidance, which they released for this coronavirus, they specifically addressed this. Like they said that, employers should know that this is a hard time for employees with psychiatric disabilities. So you might need to be more flexible in providing reasonable accommodations. Next slide. So when we're talking about addiction and substance abuse, at least in this context, at least under the Americans with Disabilities Act, we really have to look at two things, which is alcoholism and drug addiction. Addiction is a complex issue, and people can really be addicted to anything. But the way that the regulations and the guidance is framed, I thought it would be best to split it up into these two subjects. And so, like I said, addiction, it's a complex issue. And I think we try to process information that we have in the best way we can. And sometimes we're just overwhelmed with the things we're dealing with in life, and we process things way too easily. That makes sense. We like to put hats on people because it makes things a lot simpler. It just makes it a lot easier for that person to get through the day when they don't have to think about another person's pain. This comes to us, this concept comes to us when we think about people with addiction. Like, unfortunately, when some people think about a person with addiction, this is the picture they have of that person. It's a homeless person that, is not really able to contribute to society because of his psychiatric issues. Next slide. But the truth is, at least I think, and actually a lot of psychiatrists and medical professionals think, that people with addictions can become very, very good members of society. They can contribute a lot with their right support. And we have a lot of examples of that in our pop culture. One of them is Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. He talks openly about his addiction. But I think about what the world would be like if Iron Man did not exist. And to me, it would be very different, because the Marvel universe, all the movies we used to see at the theaters, they wouldn't be around, because Iron Man was really the first Marvel movie that really hit it off with the mainstream public. His involvement in the Avengers is one of the reasons. Robert Downey Jr.'s involvement in the Avengers is one of the reasons that franchise is so popular. Next slide. Another good example from our popular culture is the show Friends. Chandler, is a very popular character in that show, but the actor that played him also suffered from addiction. So that show would have been very different, if Chandler was not able to be in it. And next slide. And one of my favorite musicians is actually Johnny Cash, and he also, suffered with addiction. He talked about it openly. He had a loss when he was very young, and so he wasn't able to really deal with that in a healthy way. But I also think about all the positives that he contributed to country music, and really a lot of people that listen to Johnny Cash wouldn't really listen to country music, and so he kind of expanded the world for a lot of people, I think. And Randy, do you want to talk about this next person a bit, River Phoenix?
I added him in there. I don't know a lot about him other than he suffered from addiction and died from an overdose.
So
at a very, very young age, which was horribly sad.
Yeah, it actually happened right around the time when I came to the U.S., which was in the early 90s. yeah, he died from a heroin overdose. And for those that don't know, his brother is Joaquin Phoenix. Joaquin Phoenix, he was just in The Joker. What was the last movie he was in? And so River Phoenix was also like a very talented actor, and we see the success and the contribution that his brother has been able to provide to the arts. And it's kind of sad to think that River didn't receive the same support, I guess, or wasn't able to overcome that disability and contribute to our society still. Next slide. So focusing on alcoholism for this first analysis, there's, alcoholism can be kind of summarized with these four, alcohol dependence can be summarized with these four major symptoms. Next slide. So we get into the employment aspect of things now, and we know that employers have a right or an obligation to accommodate those employees with disabilities. Addiction is a disability specifically spelled out, in the regulations as a protected disability. So does that mean that an employer has to allow the use of alcohol at work as an accommodation for a person who is an alcoholic? No, I mean, the answer is obviously no. It's just kind of common sense. But next slide. But there are other scenarios where you have to consider that person's disability and what you can and cannot ask, in your analysis as an employer. So just some cleaning up I need to do. There's a few terms that we need to know to understand some of these concepts. These are just legalese terms. I'm going to use some simpler terms in our conversation, but I just want you to know them. So disability-related inquiries is a term that's specifically used under these regulations and the guidance in the EEOC. Another term is medical examinations. These are pretty much what an employer can and cannot ask. So when asking a question, the thing you really want to think about is this question likely to elicit information about a person's disability? And if it is, then it's a disability-related inquiry or a medical exam. So some disability-related inquiries that you might come across during the workday is, you can ask an employee's coworker about that disability. You can ask about that person's genetic information. Even when you're talking to an employee, maybe the prior workers' compensation history and so on. If the answer is likely to reveal information about that person's medical history or disability, then it's a disability-related inquiry. So some things that are not disability-related inquiries are questions like, how are you? Or how is your baby feeling? Or can you perform this job? And so on. Then we also have another term, medical exams. And those are just usually blood and urine tests that test for alcohol and other substances. And the final term we need to know is job-related and consistent with business necessity. And what that really means is that when you ask that question, you can only really ask it when it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. So when you ask those questions about a disability or a medical exam, when you make a person take a medical exam, it has to be very important to the job. as an employer, you have to have a reason for asking that question, and it has to come from a reliable source. But these are things we'll talk about in our conversations. I just wanted to get an outline. Go ahead, Randy.
George, let me interrupt with it. There's a good question here, and I think it kind of ties into exactly what you're talking about right now, because employers want to be really careful not to dig with questions the wrong way. So the question is, what would be some good conversation starters for an individual attempting to initiate those challenging conversations? And this is with employers, but I'm thinking the opposite with the employee. If the employer suspects something's going on, what are some ways to initiate those conversations? And then on the other hand, if I'm a person with a disability and I've got a situation that I need accommodated for, what are some good conversation starters for on both sides? A lot of people are scared, to give that information. They're they're fearful of judgment, what's being considered, they're not going to get considered for promotions and things like that. So can you give us some conversation starters from both perspectives?
Yes, and that's a great question. And yeah, a lot of people are scared to reveal their psychiatric disabilities. It's a scary subject. There's a lot of bias. It's kind of, going back to facing the uncertain, it's scary. And we don't know a lot about psychiatry. The general person doesn't. Even addiction. We all probably know someone that suffered with it or has it, but we don't know too much about it, so that's why it can be scary. So as an employer, like when you know this, as an employer, there's only certain times when you can ask those questions, right? First off, you can always ask, how are you? But those disability related questions, you can only bring those up when there's a good reason. One good reason is when your employee is not doing well at work, when he or she is just not performing, or if they're always late, or if they're rude to other employees, if they're not doing their job well. Another reason is if you hear or if you have information from a reliable source. So it has to be more than gossip, and these are concepts we're going to go into later. From the other side of it, if you're an employee with substance abuse issues or other psychiatric disabilities, you always have the option of going to management or someone else and starting the interactive process. And actually, as the employee, it's kind of your responsibility, because like anytime, if things go south, for example, and you're terminated, one of the first things that EEOC is going to ask you, what did you do to make things better at work? And if you don't go in asking for accommodations, there's not much protection the law gives you. So you have to go to either a manager you trust or HR, and they have a responsibility to keep that information confidential, and start asking for accommodations. And towards the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about some accommodation ideas as well. So, getting back to the presentation, like I said, there's the regulations split up alcoholism and addiction into two different, and substance abuse, like illegal drug use, into two different categories. And it's strange because when we go back to like the question of medical exams, if you test for, alcohol use, those are considered medical tests. But on the other hand, tests for illegal drug use are not. I don't understand where like the reasoning for the difference in that comes in. But the reason it's relevant is that if a test for illegal drug use is not a medical test, that means you can really just do it anytime you want. Next slide. And then the way that alcoholism or accommodating employees with substance abuse issues really comes into play is when, you know, an employee needs time off, when they need leave to seek counseling or other services. Next slide. Okay, so this is the first scenario that we're gonna test the participants on. So Randy, get ready for the polling device. So we have a person who is often late to work. His name is Michael. His boss tells him, stop being late. The third time he's late, Michael's boss gives him a written warning. But Michael comes back and tells him that, you know, he's been suffering with alcoholism and that things have been tough recently and that, you know, he's relapsing and that's why he's been late to work recently. By the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide.
And he's saying I need time off for treatment.
Yes.
That in there too.
So yeah, is Michael protected under the ADA? These are the questions we have to answer, kind of. Does the employer have to rescind the warning? Does the employer have to modify or provide accommodations like leave?
So the poll question is Michael protected under Title I of the ADA? Mm-hmm. And we've only had 14 people out of 61 answer. Come on, people. Take a leap of faith. Take a guess. I also got the little wheel spinning because I'm connected through hardline connection here at the office, so I don't understand. Okay, now we have a few more people. So about 88% say yes and about 12% say no.
Okay, so next slide. Yeah, the answer is yes. He is protected by the ADA, but yeah, but it's complicated, right? The manager or Michael's boss, he doesn't have to withdraw that written warning, right? He still holds Michael to the same standards that he holds other employees with or without disabilities. So if you show up too late to work, you know, you're going to get in trouble. The point is you're supposed to get in the same trouble as everyone else. But if Michael needs time off to seek treatment, that's when Title I comes in play, and that's how he is protected, by providing that reasonable accommodation. And so I see one question in the chat. Would it be a reasonable accommodation to allow a schedule modification so that he can attend AA, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings? And exactly, that's really the perfect example of how Title I protects those with substance abuse issues. Just making a reasonable accommodation at work so you can seek the counseling or the support that you need. Next slide. So we have another scenario. So get your polling devices ready. In this scenario, we have Isabella, and there's all these rumors going around in the office that she's an alcoholic. And so her manager, what she does is reassigns Isabella to a different job that's less stressful and unfortunately also has lower pay. And she does this out of her, the goodness of her heart. She's just concerned about Isabella, and she wants to make sure that, things are okay in her personal and at her work life. So the question we're asking is oh, okay, that's great. It popped up. How does the ADA apply? Everybody should have this pop up on their screen.
And
what do you tell me already?
I know this works for screen readers, but I just want to make sure the three options are Isabella has a disability defined by ADA, or is Isabella is being regarded as a person with a disability, and the third one is Isabella has a record of an impairment under ADA. Those are like really three ways to qualify as a person with a disability. We still have a few more people answering. Give us another second and we'll see where we're at. All right, it looks like one second. There's still people answering.
So yeah, I think that's okay. I think the point
most people said regarded as.
Yeah, and
14% said meets the definition, and then a few more people said a record of. So
yeah, so that's a great question, Randy. Like the issue here is that Isabella, we don't really know if she's an alcoholic, right? Or if she suffers from alcoholism, or she has alcoholism. All we know is that people are just saying that she does, just rumors in the office. So in this case, she's being regarded as a person with a disability. And the ADA provides protections for people like that. So unfortunately, in this case, even though Isabella's manager, she acted out of goodwill, she still violated the ADA when they reassigned Isabella. And so the other point that this scenario is trying to make is that, as a manager, you can approach employees when they're having issues at work, or you have reliable, concrete information that they're suffering from addiction. But in this case, we didn't have any of that, right? Isabella was doing okay at work, but all the rumors, that's not a reliable source. You need something from like a medical professional, or maybe even a close family member. And I think we have some Q&As. This might be a good time to take a few of those. Let's see. So one question.
Sorry, George, I'm having a lot of connection problems. So if you see something and I can't read it for you, then go ahead and take it.
Yeah, of course. So I just noticed that we had a question that asks, so the ADA states that unless you need reasonable accommodations, an employer should not question if you are disabled or if you have a disability. So why does the Department of Labor ask for self-identification of disability when applying for a job? So this is a great question. In that situation, what you're really encountering is an affirmative action program. You can always identify as a person with a disability voluntarily, but you don't have to, right? Some employers have a responsibility to, like an affirmative action kind of responsibility. And so that's what that question is really addressing.
George,
but you don't have to
correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it federal employers are supposed to have 7% of their workforce is supposed to be people with disabilities, correct?
Yeah, and that's...
And so that must be where that's coming from.
Mm-hmm. and also federal contractors, organizations that work for federal governments have a similar responsibility. Yeah. And so we have another question. Isn't the employee required to make his need known before he or she gets in trouble and tries to play the ADA card? Yeah, so like in the scenario we had where I think it was Michael got in trouble for being late to work. Yeah, the way he should have probably handled that is ask for assistance before being late to work, right? And asking for time off, using his time off before that happened. But the world's not perfect. And most scenarios, most facts in the real world are not. Next slide, please.
We had another question here. I'm not sure. Well, one applies to what you were talking about. One may be from earlier. How does a small business pay for programs for addiction?
Yeah, I don't know there are like any specific programs for like from the government, at least. I mean, I'm sure there are.
The employer's not responsible for the program, correct? That would be the individual's responsibility to get into a program or something.
Yeah, of course. Like the employer only has to provide time off. The employee is responsible for seeking out the proper medical or supportive care. Correct.
Does time off have to be paid?
So not under the ADA and FMLA. Most, the law only guarantees you time off, and when you get back, you have your job. It doesn't guarantee that you get paid during that time. But, most employers have programs like PTO or insurance for disability related injuries and stuff like that.
And one more question. How does Title I in the ADA come into effect with healthcare providers with mental illness or substance abuse? Are they protected, or is there a caveat? So I guess the employer is the healthcare provider.
Okay, I think this is asking about maybe those in clinical positions that have substance abuse issues. And yeah, I mean, everyone is protected with a disability under the ADA, but like the question said, there's a caveat. There's certain industries where those questions, those disability related questions, you can ask more frequently, like police officers and firefighters as well, people who drive like trucks and so on, like anything that has to do with where you can injure someone if you're under the influence and so on, it becomes much more reasonable for the employer to ask those types of questions. Next slide. So we're gonna just go into drug addiction now, the other kind of category that the EEOC regulations have. And it kind of like with alcoholism, it's a disability and a medical condition where the psychiatric disability can cause a lot of behavioral characteristics. And these are kind of some of the characteristics, if you notice in your employee, these are, this is a scientific basis for you to bring up questions. If you notice that your employee is always late to work or disappears and becomes unreliable, their productivity suffers at work and so on, those may be signals that your employee is has substance abuse issues. Next slide, please. So, like I said, the EEOC regulations make a distinction If you're a person who's an alcoholic and you drink, you are still protected, right? You're still protected under the law. But if you engage in the illegal use of drugs, you're not really protected by the ADA. So essentially, I mean, in practice, I think the reason I make this distinction is because those with drug addictions actually have kind of a lesser protection. But either way, whether it's alcoholism or drug addiction, the employer can always hold you to the same standards as everyone else. Next slide. And this is just kind of a better explanation of that concept, of that distinction that the regulations make. Whenever they have an employee who's using illegal drugs, they can terminate them, or any other procedure that they do normally. But those who are alcoholics have a bit of a different protection, or different steps they can take. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go back to the scenario we had earlier with Michael, and it's pretty much the same thing, right? He's just always late to work, and on the third time, his boss is like, I'm just going to give you a written warning now. So the difference this time, though, is that the reason he's been late to work is not that he's been up drinking all night. It's because he's been up all night doing cocaine, and that but he wants the same thing. He wants to go get time off and get treatment. So I think this is another polling question, right, Randy?
Yes, sir.
So is in this scenario, is Michael protected under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act? The options are yes or no.
Mm-hmm. People are answering. We've got about not even quite half yet have answered. So give it another few seconds. A few more people. Only 27 of the 61 are answering. That's counting the panelists, but you don't have to answer as a panelist. So
what's the ratio?
I'm going to end the polling and show you the results so far. It's almost half and half. 56% say no, 44% say yes.
Yeah, and common sense kind of tells you that's what I was kind of expecting. It's because it's pretty much the same thing, right? The only thing we took out is alcohol. I just took out the word alcohol and put in cocaine. So the same exact scenario, but except for that one factor, right? And that's what changes it, because this is illegal drug use as opposed to alcohol use. The employee is not protected. So the employer can just terminate the employee for that violation or any other disciplinary action they want to do. The key point is that the employer does not have to accommodate the employee in that scenario. I think we have a question. Let's see if it's relevant.
Yeah, it's what you were just saying. Because it's an illegal substance, it changes the answer to no protections.
Yeah, can we go back one slide, please?
Sure.
Yeah, so it's the same scenario that we had where Michael is late to work, but instead of being late to work because he was up drinking, it's because he was doing cocaine, an illegal drug, and it's just a distinction that the regulations make in the way they interpret the law. And so that's why I always split this presentation up like this. I think it's an important distinction for employers and employees to know. Next slide.
We have another question. Is the reason for the difference because the alcohol is legal and illegal drugs are illegal? Right. That is
Yes.
exactly why.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. And we move on.
Okay, and this is just kind of the concept that we've been talking about, that employers can hold employees with substance abuse issues to the same standards as everyone else. So if you violate the policy of an employee, if an employee does something bad at work or otherwise, and even if it stems from their disability, you're still going to face the same consequences as those other employees. Next slide. Okay, so we have another scenario. In this one, we have a delivery truck driver for Amazon, and while working, he has an accident, and he's charged with DUI during that accident. And 1 month later, Amazon decides to fire him, and then the employee comes back and says that, I have an issue. I'm an alcoholic and I've been seeking treatment. So can I please continue my job? Is this another polling situation, I think?
Yes, sir, it is. So the question is, in this scenario, come on.
Yeah, can the employer terminate the driver? Yes or no?
And people are answering.
So yeah.
This is pretty, they're getting smarter. Right now we have 97% say yes.
Yeah. I was kind of trying to throw you off by giving you like an illegal use and then an alcoholic in there. But yes, it's the concept that, in that situation, if you're in an accident and you get a DUI, you're going to be fired from any delivery company, right? The fact that you're an alcoholic or you have alcoholism, that doesn't give you any extra protections in that scenario. So we have, go ahead.
I was going to ask, do we have any questions? He's ready to take more questions. Does Michael have to disclose the nature of his addiction to the employer? Ooh, that's a good one. Like maybe he could say it was alcohol when it was drugs. So does he have to disclose the nature of his addiction to the employer?
That's a great question. And no, he does not.
It is.
He, as a practical matter, when you request, as an employee with a disability, when you request accommodations, you're always concerned about confidentiality and not revealing too much. So yes, I think that if you're under the care of like a psychiatrist, that psychiatrist could explain your disabilities without revealing the fact that it's an illegal substance.
We do have another question. It's in the chat box though. It's, does the scenario change if the substance is marijuana in states where it is legal? So I think this is going back to like the cocaine question, to that scenario. So if it's marijuana and it's legal in that state, then the substance, does it change the scenario?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So let's imagine that we're like in a state like Colorado where marijuana is legal, and doctors prescribe it for all kinds of medical conditions and disabilities. The problem is that even though it's legal in that state, we're talking about the ADA, which is a federal law. And the federal government says, yes, go ahead, Randy.
I just said, oh.
I thought you said no. But yeah, the federal government says there's no good character. It's a restricted substance. You can't use it no matter what. And that's where it comes. So the federal law, the ADA, is a federal law that gives you those protections when you have a disability. Unfortunately, it's only the state that allows you to smoke or use marijuana if you have a disability. So there's not a consistency in laws there. So the ADA and the state law just don't mix up in that situation. But I have another one. Let's imagine we're in California now, right? California has a state law that's very similar to the ADA and actually provides more protections. And in California, we have also, people can use marijuana legally. So in that scenario, I think it hasn't really come up in the courts yet, but I can't see a scenario where a state law can provide, the state disability rights law can provide protections in that case, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
We have another question. If you were a driver and have never gotten in trouble, so say go back to the driver position, never gotten in trouble and violated any laws, if you request accommodations for alcoholism, can you be fired?
Okay, no, I don't think so. So I think you're asked, yeah, if you've never been disciplined, what you're really just asking for is time off, right? Is that the accommodation you're asking for? Then that's completely appropriate. But if you're still suffering from alcoholism and are using alcohol, the employer can still put you on leave because you're creating an unsafe scenario. So you are protected, but not like absolutely protected.
So I think that's a really good question. So if I'm driving for Amazon and I've never gotten in any trouble, and I realize I have a problem with alcoholism and I want to get treatment, or I need time off to go to AA meetings or something like that. And so I request as an accommodation that I can still get in some trouble because of the position I have.
Yeah.
Saying?
Yeah, because that brings, because your employer has like a reasonable concern.
Yeah.
They have a reasonable concern that you're creating. It's referred to as a direct threat. That's the legalese language. But you're just creating an unsafe environment for yourself and others. If you're a person who is drinking and driving, I'm guessing, is what I'm saying. The way you cure that issue is that you go to counseling. Maybe you get supporting letter from either AA members or your AA sponsor or your psychiatrist and so on. That's how you cure that safety concern. That you're not drinking anymore.
So that might be a good way to frame it when you ask for the accommodation. Another question, if you reveal that you have been drinking and driving, you would have a problem. If you have never drank and drove, you should be okay, shouldn't you? So you're not drinking on the job while you're doing the Amazon driving around, but you drink too much when you're off, I guess is what that's saying.
Yeah, and now we're getting into the very murky area of the ocean.
Yeah.
Because
if
yeah, the employer could argue, okay, you're not drinking on the job, but if you're up all night drinking and if you're hungover, you know, you could still not be operating the machinery correctly. And really, I'm not I'm not I'm not qualified to make this judgment. If you ever went to court, it would have to be like expert testimony, like I said again, testimony from like your psychiatrist and people that can testify to the cognitive impairments that person would be under.
Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay, and so now we're at the final stage of the presentation. We're just going to talk about like a few accommodation ideas for employees with substance abuse issues. And the good thing is these are also mainly the questions you're going to ask other employees about other employees with disabilities. You just kind of look at what's going on at work, how the disability is affecting that job, and what can be done to you know, to cure or address that problem. Next slide. So a good accommodation idea that the EEOC and, you know, just other people as well recommend is to offer a firm choice or a last chance agreement. And this is the employer pretty much, your boss pretty much tells you this, you know, I know things have been bad here. I know it's from your alcoholism or your addiction, your drug addiction. Go get some help. Get some help. And when you can come back, and if you can come back and you can do things well, you know, you can have your job back. But if you don't get help and if, you know, you continue this bad behavior, you're going to be terminated. You know, we're giving you a last chance. And this is always a good option for employees, and it's also a good option for employers, because if you ever do get into an issue where there is a complaint against you, you have proof that you tried, right, as an employer, that you gave your employee a chance to address their issues and that you gave them job protection. So if you, from a risk basis, if you're ever sued or have a complaint against you as an employer, this is always kind of a good way to make sure that that doesn't go too far. Next slide. And a lot of corporations have employee assistance programs. And as an employer, you can, and if you notice that your employee is having issues at work, you can always suggest that they, you know, seek out this program. And in fact, you can also make this part of your last chance agreement. You can, you know, you can kind of require your employees to pursue this program as a last option before termination. Next slide. And like, honestly, the most common accommodation that employees with substance abuse issues will have or will ask for is time off, so they can get counseling or go to a rehab program or seek support groups or other self-help programs. And you know, it doesn't, so here's where the flexibility part of it comes into play, I guess, as an employee, as an employer. You know, modified schedules are usually pretty reasonable. You're gonna have to prove that a modified schedule is not reasonable. It's gonna be a difficult task. So giving your employee like an extra hour off and having them make that time up later on may be a reasonable accommodation if it means that they go to an AA meeting or their psychiatry appointment during that time. Next slide. And these are just accommodation ideas that help with like stress and anxiety in the workplace. So they, you know, psychiatric disabilities and addictions are very closely related. So these are always a good way to make the workplace less stressful and thus, you know, I guess less triggering for people with addictions, so they can operate effectively. And I think we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions. Next slide. So at the ADA Center, we're here just because this presentation is over. Doesn't mean that, you know, that you're on your own. Essentially, like, we're here to answer any questions you have. Our number is 1-800-949-4232. You can also email us if you go on our website. Any questions you have, I or someone else from the ADA Center will answer in a pretty timely fashion. Another good resource is the Job Accommodation Network. They just know so much about providing accommodations at work for all types of disabilities. They're really the experts in that field. So when you're out of ideas for accommodating employees, or you're an employee that doesn't know what to do about accommodations, the Job Accommodation Network, they can probably answer or give you a good idea. And then for the enforcement aspect, it's the EEOC. Remember, just because we're the ADA Center does not mean that we are the ADA police. We don't have any enforcement responsibility, and we don't want it, really. The employment aspect of the ADA is enforced by the EEOC. You have a limited time to file a complaint after you face discrimination. And some people, you know, when things go bad at work and they're fired, they try to seek out a lawyer and file a lawsuit.
And you don't have a lot of time. After you get the right to sue letter, you only have like 90 days, I think, to file a lawsuit. So if you don't already, if you're not already I've just seen people experience this where they're going, oh, now I need an attorney, and it's hard to find somebody that fast and get things filed timely. Another resource for individuals with disabilities too would be Disability Rights Texas. And I'll pop my video back on, but Disability Rights Texas is our state's protection and advocacy organization for people with disabilities, and they take some employment cases. They take a lot of other things too, and they have priorities, so they can't take everything, but they can sometimes help people with disabilities with their complaints, and they look for resolution, not lawsuits. They really try to resolve the issue so that it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, and I mean, you always want to try and settle the issue internally, really, because if you file a complaint with the EEOC, their average, you know, their average time to finish the complaint is 9 months, and even at the end of that, you're more than likely just going to get a right to sue letter saying that you can go out and hire an attorney. So it's just, as an employee, you have to be an advocate for yourself, but you also have to be reasonable, and just have to understand everything, the consequences of everything, I guess.
So we're ready to take some other questions. If people want to post their questions in the Q&A box, George can answer those for you. In the meantime, we will send the presentation materials out and the real-time captioning transcript. It may take a couple of weeks. It's been kind of crazy here, and we have a committee meeting yesterday, and we had some coming up. So those kinds of things interfere as we're prepping for other things, COVID impact and all that as well. So we'll get them out as soon as we can. Al Henderson, come on, ask a question. I know you're out there. Al is an ADA coordinator out of the Fort Worth area. Looking at the participant list, see if there's anybody else I know that I can pick on. We've had a couple of questions, really good questions too. So I want to thank participants for those.
So yeah, I think we had an issue or in the chat asking a bit more about the marijuana.
Oh, was there another question about that? I missed that then. And
yeah,
you do have another question coming up. What is one of the biggest misconceptions about reasonable accommodations?
Yeah, I think that employers think it's always a lot more difficult or costly than it is. And like one of the first slides I told you about, it's, you know, the average accommodation is about $500, which is not that expensive when you think about just how a business operates. As an operational cost, it's not very much, I think, or even like a small business. And a lot of times, especially with these substance abuse issues, the proper accommodation is just time off or a modified schedule. So there's not too much extra cost on the employer. So the biggest misconception, I think, is that it's difficult when it's not.
And we had another question earlier, but I wasn't quite clear on what they were asking. So here's the question, and then I'll give you the clarifying response. With HR and hiring managers, is there a mandated course or federal logging of hours of ADA training for their organization, including private companies like a Christian hospital, or does 503 or 504 come into play? And I said I wasn't really clear what you were asking about the training component. And they said, I do apologize, I was meaning the difference between federal and private. So
so I know
logging hours of ADA training for their organization. So is there a difference between federal and private hours of logging training? I've never heard anything or a requirement like that, so I don't know.
Right. There's not any requirement under the ADA to do any type of training. But of course, employers and other companies always do that. It's a good way to not violate the law. But there's not like a black and white written statement saying you have to have 50 hours of so-and-so training.
I see. Okay. Anything different with 503 or 504?
I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure about the Rehab Act.
And Patricia is asking, can you explain again about marijuana, for instance? In MA, I think that's Massachusetts, we have allowed marijuana and difference in the medical marijuana. Oh, is there a difference if you're allowed marijuana and medical marijuana? Would there be a difference in that?
No, and that's what I was really referring to. I was really referring to recreational use.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, well, here I'm going to use just an example.
Okay.
We have an employee named Jimmy. He has depression and anxiety, PTSD, and suffers from substance abuse issues. He lives in Colorado, where marijuana use is legal. His psychiatrist recommends that he use marijuana for for his disability. Doesn't matter. The short answer is doesn't matter. the ADA doesn't provide any type of protection because it's a federal law, and the federal government just says marijuana cannot
Is illegal.
is illegal. Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. That's interesting. That's interesting. Another question, can a person with a psychiatric disability ask for an accommodation when their work has been good and they have never shown a need for an accommodation?
Yeah, you can always ask for an accommodation. You might always have had good reviews and nothing bad is going on, but if you feel like there's a reason for it, you can always ask for one. Yeah.
I'm thinking it could be something even like, not related to addiction maybe, but even like, say you have depression and it's difficult to get up in the mornings and you shift your schedule 9 to 6 instead of 8 to 5. That might be a reasonable accommodation, but you haven't shown the need for it yet, but it could really help you. Another question, is the employer obligated to provide that accommodation in that case, if they've never shown a need for one?
Okay. Again, that's not a judgment I can make, because the thing about reasonable accommodations to remember is that you have to have it on a fact, each one has to be on a case-by-case basis. So if you tell me everything, like about the case, like about what the job is, the circumstances under it, you need to know the financial resources of the employer, how many other employees there are. You need to know the essential functions of the job, the ancillary functions of the job. These are all things you have to take in as an employer, and there's an equation, and you come out with an answer at the end. But it all has to be case by cases, on a case by case basis.
And there's another question, and I don't know what this form is. Maybe this is a federal form. The individual says, I have to fill out IEEs one time a year for my disabled adults and the accommodations I have to make for them. What is the main reason for the forms needing filled out? Is an IEE a federal form that might have to be completed by a federal contractor or something? They said yes, it's a federal form. So what would be the reason they have to fill it out every year?
I'm not sure what that form refers to.
James, you might email that question to, you can send the Southwest ADA Center's email address.
Is it individual eligibility evaluation? I mean, this might be something that either like a state agency has in place, or your employer, if it's a nonprofit, but it's not, again, one of those things that's required black and white by the ADA in any way.
Yeah, it might be a federal, he says, yes, they're nonprofit.
Yeah, it might be just a form, especially if you're a federal contractor, yeah, a form that your employer requires, but that's not really an ADA related form.
So any other last questions? I'm not seeing any, George. So I want to thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. This is great information and a subject not often talked about. So especially the addiction side, I guess the drug addiction side, not as much as the alcohol addiction side, but really great information. And I want to thank Texas Closed Captioning this morning for their services for the captioning. And I see no other questions, so I think we'll just close for the day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.